The streetlights cast long shadows across the nearly empty parking garage as Lieutenant Maya Rodriguez pulled into her usual spot after another exhausting shift. The clock on her dashboard showed 11:43 p.m., later than she'd planned to stay at the precinct, but paperwork had a way of piling up when you were running the department. She sat in her car for a moment, letting out a deep breath and rolling her shoulders to release the tension from hours hunched over case files. The garage was unusually quiet tonight. Usually, she'd hear the distant sounds of cars on the main road or the echo of footsteps from other residents coming home late, but tonight there was nothing but the soft hum of fluorescent lights. As she gathered her things, her bag, a stack of files she'd brought home to review, and an empty travel mug that had kept her going through the day, something caught her eye. The security camera that normally pointed toward her parking space was hanging at an odd angle, its lens facing the concrete wall instead of the rows of cars it was meant to monitor. 15 years on the force had taught Maya to trust her instincts, and right now they were telling her something wasn't right. She placed her belongings back on the passenger seat and took a careful look around. The garage looked normal enough, the same cars she saw every day, the same flickering light in the corner that maintenance had been promising to fix for weeks, the same emergency exit sign glowing red in the distance. But something felt off. Maya had made captain 6 months ago, becoming one of the youngest women to achieve the rank in the department's history. Her colleagues had celebrated with cake and coffee in the break room, but she knew the real work was just beginning. She'd earned her position through a combination of sharp instincts, dedication, and an uncanny ability to read people and situations. Those same instincts were now telling her to be extra cautious. She pulled out her phone and dialed the building's security office, but only got an automated message saying the guard would return shortly. Strange, there was supposed to be someone on duty 24/7. Through her partially open window, she caught a whiff of cigarette smoke. Fresh smoke, which meant someone had been here recently. None of her neighbors smoked. It was against building regulations, and she knew most of them well enough to be sure they followed the rules. Maya checked her side mirror, scanning the reflection of the area behind her car. The garage had 6 levels, and she always parked on the 3rd, close to the elevator, but with a clear view of both the entrance and exit ramps. It was a habit she developed early in her career. Always know your escape routes. She noticed small details now that she hadn't registered when pulling in. A candy wrapper that hadn't been there this morning, skid marks from tires that looked fresh, and most concerning, the emergency exit door was propped open slightly with what appeared to be a folded piece of cardboard. Anyone else might have brushed these signs off as coincidence, but Maya had spent too many years investigating crimes to believe in coincidences. She reached for her phone again, this time to call dispatch, when movement in her rearview mirror caught her attention. A shadow passed between the parked cars about 30 feet behind her. Someone was trying very hard not to be seen. Maya kept her movements casual, as if she was still just gathering her things to head home. Inside, her mind was racing through scenarios and options. Her service weapon was secured in her ankle holster. Department policy required officers to remain armed even off duty. Her badge was in her jacket pocket, and her tactical flashlight was in her bag. The garage's cameras had been tampered with, the security guard was mysteriously absent, and someone was lurking in the shadows. This wasn't random. This was planned. She thought about Mrs. Chen from the 5th floor, who had reported a suspicious person watching the building last week. At the time, it had seemed like the typical concerns of a cautious resident. Now, Maya wondered if she should have dug deeper into that report. The air felt heavier now, charged with tension. Maya could hear soft footsteps trying to be quiet, but echoing slightly in the concrete structure. Whoever was out there was moving closer, probably thinking they had the element of surprise. They didn't know she could hear them. They didn't know she had spent years training for situations exactly like this. Most importantly, they didn't know who she was. Maya glanced at her watch, 11:47 p.m. The night shift would be doing their routine patrol of the area in about 15 minutes. If she could stall long enough. But no, she couldn't count on that. Whatever was about to happen would be over long before backup arrived by chance. She needed to take control of the situation. She pulled her phone closer, keeping it low and out of sight, and typed a quick message to dispatch. Her fingers moved automatically, typing the code that every officer knew but hoped never to use. officer in potential danger, requesting immediate backup. The footsteps were closer now. Maya could tell from the sound that it was just one person, probably male, based on the weight of the steps. They were trying to approach from her blind spot, using the cars as cover. She kept her breathing steady, her muscles relaxed but ready. Years of training had taught her that tension would only slow her reactions. She needed to stay calm, stay focused, and most importantly, stay in control. Through the reflection in her window, she caught a glimpse of movement, dark clothes, a hood pulled low. The figure was still too far away to make out clearly, but their body language screamed predator. Maya felt a familiar sense of calm settle over her, the same feeling she got before leading a raid or making a difficult arrest. This wasn't fear, this was preparation. Her mind was clear, taking in every detail, every sound, every possible move and countermove. She had two choices. She could reveal herself as law enforcement now, possibly diffusing the situation before it escalated, or she could wait and let events unfold, potentially gathering enough evidence to make a solid case. Both options had their risks. The weight of her badge in her pocket seemed heavier now. It wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a responsibility. Whatever choice she made wouldn't just affect her, it would affect every future victim this person might target. The footsteps stopped. Maya knew what came next, the moment of hesitation before action, the deep breath before the storm. She'd seen it countless times in surveillance footage, heard it described by victims, witnessed it firsthand in confrontations. Her hand moved slowly toward her ankle holster as she waited for the next move. The garage was silent now, the kind of silence that screams with tension, where even the hum of the fluorescent lights seems to hold its breath. What happened in the next few moments would change everything. Maya knew this with the same certainty that had guided her through 15 years of service. But unlike the person approaching her car, she also knew something else. The man who thought he found an easy target had been watching the parking garage for nearly 2 weeks. From his hidden vantage point behind the dumpsters across the street, he'd studied the patterns of people coming and going, noting which cars belonged to women who seemed to live alone. The blue sedan had caught his attention 5 days ago. Its driver always arrived home late, usually in business attire, and carried a laptop bag. He'd assumed she was some kind of office worker, maybe a lawyer or accountant, someone who wouldn't be much trouble. He couldn't have been more wrong. Tonight had seemed perfect. He'd managed to tilt the security camera away from his target area using a long pole he brought specifically for that purpose. The regular security guard had called in sick, something about food poisoning that may or may not have been related to the tampered sandwich left in the break room fridge. Everything was going according to plan. At least, that's what he thought as he crouched behind a concrete pillar, watching the blue sedan pull into its usual spot. He'd done this before. 3 times in the past month, in fact. Each time he'd gotten away clean. Each time he'd felt more confident, more in control. He adjusted the gloves on his hands. Cheap ones from a dollar store, the kind that wouldn't leave prints. The knife in his pocket was starting to feel warm from his grip. His heart wasn't racing anymore like it had the first time. Now it was just a steady thrum of anticipation. The woman was still in her car. She seemed to be gathering her things, moving slowly, tired after a long day at work. Perfect. Tired people made mistakes. Tired people were easier to surprise. He took a silent step forward, staying in the shadows. Years of petty crime had taught him how to move quietly, how to blend into dark corners where people didn't look. But something felt different tonight. There was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind, like an itch he couldn't scratch. Maybe it was the way she sat in her car. Most people just grabbed their things and got out, eager to get home. She was taking her time, almost like she was watching something. But that was impossible. He'd been careful, so careful. From his position, he could see her reflection in the car's side mirror. She was looking down at her phone, probably checking messages or social media. Just another distracted woman, unaware of her surroundings. That's what he told himself, pushing away the strange feeling that something wasn't quite right. He'd chosen this garage carefully. It was in an upscale area where people felt safe, where they let their guard down. The layout was perfect, plenty of blind spots, poor lighting in the corners, and minimal security cameras. He knew every exit, every stairwell, every place to hide if things went wrong. But they never went wrong. Not for him. The woman's foam lit up her face for a moment. He caught a glimpse of high cheekbones, dark hair pulled back neatly. Professional looking, probably lived alone. Probably had nice things in her apartment. The kind of things that would fetch a good price from his usual fence. He took another step forward, moving from behind one pillar to the next. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, creating strange shadows that worked in his favor. 20 feet now, close enough to see more details. Her car was well maintained but not flashy. There was a small scratch on the rear bumper. A parking permit hung from the rearview mirror. 15 feet. He could smell her perfume now, something light and expensive. The kind of scent that suggested money. His fingers tightened around the knife in his pocket. Just a few more steps. But that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. Something about her posture, the way she held herself even while sitting, it reminded him of someone. Who was it? A cop who'd questioned him once? No, that wasn't it. 10 feet. Almost time. His pulse should have been racing by now, but instead he felt an unfamiliar sensation creeping up his spine. Was it doubt? He watched her check her watch. The movement was smooth, practiced, like someone who was used to keeping track of time, used to waiting, used to. That's when it hit him. She moved like his older brother had moved, back when he'd been in the military. Economy of motion, they'd called it. No wasted movements. Always aware of their surroundings. But it was too late to back out now. He'd disabled the camera. He'd made sure the security guard wouldn't be around. He committed to this. And anyway, he was probably just being paranoid. Women like her, professional types, they sometimes took self-defense classes. That's all it was. 5 feet. He could see her more clearly now. The jacket she wore was well cut, expensive looking. There might be a wallet in those pockets, credit cards he could sell, a phone he could wipe and flip for quick cash. 4 feet. She shifted in her seat and something caught the light. Something metal near her ankle. His mind registered what it was a split second too late. 3 feet. She wasn't checking her phone anymore. In fact, her hand wasn't anywhere near her phone. 2 feet. That feeling of doubt exploded into full-blown realization. The way she sat, the metal at her ankle, the perfect positioning of her car, it all made horrible sense now. 1 foot. He saw her eyes in the side mirror, looking directly at his reflection. They weren't the eyes of a tired office worker. They weren't afraid. They weren't surprised. They were ready. In that moment, as his hand closed around the knife in his pocket, as he prepared to step out of the shadows, he finally understood his mistake. He'd spent 2 weeks watching her, thinking he was the predator. But he'd never been the hunter. He'd been the prey. The realization came just as she moved, and in that instant, he knew with crystal clarity that his perfect plan, his careful preparation, his confidence, it had all led him straight into a trap. A trap he'd set for himself by targeting the one person in this building he should have avoided at all costs. Time seemed to slow down as the attacker emerged from behind the pillar. Maya watched through her mirror as he stepped into view, his movements betraying the moment he realized his terrible mistake. But pride or desperation pushed him forward anyway. The knife in his hand caught the fluorescent light, a cheap kitchen blade, probably bought at a discount store. Maya noted these details automatically, the way she'd been trained to observe everything in high-pressure situations. The blade was about 6 inches long. His grip was wrong. Too tight, too high on the handle. Amateur. She let him take that first step toward her car door. It was important to establish clear intent. Years of prosecuting cases had taught her the value of irrefutable evidence. Right now, dozens of security cameras in nearby buildings were recording everything. She'd made sure of that when she'd first noticed the tampered garage camera. Her car door opened smoothly, silently. She'd had the hinges oiled last week, not because she'd expected this, but because she believed in maintaining everything in perfect working order. Her movements were unhurried, deliberate. No sudden gestures that might trigger a premature reaction. "Police," she said clearly, her voice carrying in the concrete structure. "Drop the weapon." She saw the confusion flash across his face, followed by disbelief, then fear. But something else too, a kind of desperate determination. Sometimes, she knew from experience, that was the most dangerous emotion of all. He adjusted his grip on the knife, shifting his weight forward. "You're lying," he said, but his voice trembled slightly. "You're just trying to scare me." Maya stepped fully out of the car now, her badge catching the light as she moved. She kept her stance relaxed but ready, her hands visible but close to her body. Everything about her posture said professional, trained, in control. "I'm giving you a chance," she said, her tone firm but not aggressive. "Drop the knife. Don't make this worse than it already is." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, creating strange shadows on the concrete floor. A car horn honked somewhere in the distance. These details registered in her mind automatically, part of the constant awareness that had kept her alive through countless situations like this. He was young. She realized now that she could see him clearly. Younger than she'd initially thought. Maybe mid-20s. His clothes were cheap but clean. This wasn't some drug-crazed attack. This was calculated, planned. That made him more dangerous, not less. 3 other women, she said, watching his reaction. All in the past month. All in parking garages like this one. We've been building the case. We have DNA. His eyes widened slightly, confirmation. But instead of backing down, he tightened his grip on the knife. Sometimes, she knew, cornered people made the worst decisions. "You don't know anything," he spat, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "You're making that up." Maya kept her voice steady, professional. Blue Honda Civic parked 3 blocks away. License plate starts with XRJ. The sandwich you left in the security officer's fridge, we already have it in evidence. Your brother's military service doesn't excuse what you've done. Each detail hit him like a physical blow. She saw the moment he realized how completely he'd been outmaneuvered. But that was the dangerous moment, when someone realized they had nothing left to lose. He moved suddenly, the knife slashing through the air where she had been standing a split second before. But Maya had been ready for this. She'd seen the tension in his shoulders, the slight shift in his weight that telegraphed his intention. Her response was automatic, trained into muscle memory through thousands of hours of practice. She stepped inside his reach, where the knife was less effective. Her left hand caught his wrist, her right foot hooked behind his ankle. Physics and momentum did the rest. The impact of his body hitting the concrete echoed through the garage. The knife clattered away, spinning under a nearby car. He tried to roll away, but Maya had already secured his arm in a joint lock that made any movement excruciating. "It's over," she said firmly, her knee pressed against his shoulder blade. "Don't make it worse." He struggled for a moment, testing her grip, but the pressure on his joints convinced him of the futility. She could feel a fight drain out of him, replaced by the heavy resignation of someone who knew they'd lost everything. The sound of approaching sirens filled the garage. Her backup was right on time. She'd texted them the moment she'd spotted him, knowing exactly how long it would take them to arrive. Everything had been timed perfectly. "How?" he gasped, his face pressed against the concrete. "How did you know?" Maya secured his other arm, smoothly applying the handcuffs she'd drawn from her belt. "We've been watching you for days. Every time you surveilled this garage, we were surveilling you. Those other attacks, the victims remembered details, small things. The way you walked, the smell of cigarettes, the type of gloves you wore." She could hear boots on concrete now, her fellow officers arriving, taking up positions, securing the scene. Everything by the book, everything professional. "Your mistake," she continued, keeping him secured until her colleagues reached them, "was thinking you were the only one watching. In my garage, in my building, where my neighbors live." The backup officers reached them, their flashlights cutting through the shadows. Maya recognized them all. Good officers, people she'd trained personally. They moved with practiced efficiency, taking control of the suspect, reading him his rights, beginning the careful process of documentation that would help ensure a conviction. As they led him away, Maya noticed his expression had changed. The desperate bravado was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like relief. Sometimes, she knew, getting caught was easier than waiting to be caught. She watched as they put him in the back of a patrol car, its lights painting the garage walls in rotating red and blue. Evidence technicians were already arriving, photographing the scene, collecting the knife, documenting everything. One of the officers approached her with a notepad, ready to take her statement. She nodded, knowing the importance of recording everything while it was fresh in her mind. But first, she sent a quick text to building management. The security cameras needed to be checked regularly from now on. The lighting needed to be better. The security protocols needed to be stricter. Because while this particular threat had been neutralized, there would always be others. And Maya knew, as she began giving her statement, that her real work was just beginning. Not just solving crimes, but preventing them. Not just catching predators, but making it harder for them to find prey. That was what the badge really meant. Not just authority, but responsibility. Not just power, but protection. The interrogation room was quiet except for the soft hum of the fluorescent lights and the ticking of the wall clock. Maya sat across from her would-be attacker, watching as he fidgeted with the handcuffs securing him to the table. The metal badge on her chest felt heavier than usual as she opened the case file. "Let's start from the beginning," she said, her voice calm and professional. "You didn't know who I was when you chose me as a target, did you?" He looked up briefly, then back down at his hands. The tough exterior from the parking garage had crumbled, leaving behind someone who looked young and scared. His voice was barely above a whisper. "No, I thought you were just another office worker." Maya spread out several photographs on the table, surveillance shots from various parking garages, security camera stills, evidence photos. 3 other attacks in the past month. All professional women. All parking garages. All between 11 p.m. and midnight. She watched his face as he glanced at the photos. There was recognition there, and something else. Shame, maybe. Or regret. She'd seen that look before, when perpetrators finally faced the reality of their actions. "We've been building this case for weeks," she continued. "The first victim remembered your cologne. The second one noticed how you favored your right leg slightly when you walked. The third remembered the sound of your voice. Small details, but they add up." He shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The interrogation room felt smaller now, the walls closer. Outside, through the one-way glass, she knew her fellow officers were watching, recording everything. "I want to understand something," Maya said, leaning forward slightly. "You're not some random street criminal. You planned these attacks carefully. You studied your targets. You disabled security cameras. You even managed to get the security guard out of the way. Why?" He looked up at her then, really looked at her for the first time since they'd brought him in. "You wouldn't understand. Try me." A long moment passed. The clock ticked. Down the hall, someone closed a door. Finally, he spoke, his words coming out in a rush. Everything looked so easy for them. The Win and I. Targeted. Nice cars, nice clothes, nice lives. Meanwhile, I can barely make rent. Can't find a decent job. Can't. "So you decided to take what they had?" Maya kept her voice neutral, professional. "Make their lives as difficult as yours." "Something like that." He slumped in his chair. "Sounds stupid when you say it out loud." Maya pulled out another photograph, the kitchen knife from the parking garage, now tagged as evidence. "This was a serious weapon. You weren't just planning to rob them, were you?" He flinched at the sight of the knife. "I just wanted to scare them. Make them feel powerless, like I feel every day." "And now?" Maya gestured to his handcuffs. "How does it feel to be the powerless one?" The question hung in the air between them. Outside the interrogation room, she could hear the usual sounds of the precinct, phones ringing, officers talking, the coffee machine in the break room beeping. Normal sounds that probably seemed very far away to him right now. "I never meant," he started, then stopped. Started again. "When you said you were police, I thought you were lying. But then I saw your badge, saw how you moved, and I knew. I knew I'd made a huge mistake." Maya nodded slowly. "You made several mistakes. The biggest one was thinking that making others suffer would somehow make your life better." She stood up, gathering the photographs into a neat pile. "Here's what happens next. You're going to be charged with multiple counts of attempted assault, attempted robbery, and tonight, attempting to attack a police officer. The evidence is solid. The victims can identify you. We have DNA from where you cut yourself breaking the security camera." His shoulders slumped further. "How much time?" "That depends on a lot of things, including how cooperative you are." Maya paused, considering her next words carefully. "Those other women you attacked, they have lives, families, dreams, just like you. They work hard, just like you. The difference is they didn't choose to hurt others when things got tough." A tear rolled down his cheek. He wiped it away quickly with his shoulder, trying to maintain what little dignity he had left. "I can't take it back, can I?" "No," Maya said firmly. "But you can help make sure we have everything we need to close this case properly. You can show those women that you understand what you did was wrong. That counts for something. She moved toward the door, then turned back. One more thing. When you were watching me, planning your attack, did you ever wonder about the people you were targeting? Who they were? What their stories might be? He shook his head slowly. That was your biggest mistake, she said, because if you had, you might have realized that everyone has their own struggles. Everyone has moments of feeling powerless. The difference is in how we choose to handle those moments. The door opened and 2 officers entered to escort him to his cell. Maya watched as they led him away, his head bowed, his steps uncertain. In the fluorescent light, he looked even younger, more lost. She gathered her files and headed back to her office. There would be paperwork to file, reports to write, meetings with the district attorney. The legal process would grind forward, turning this night into evidence, testimony, and eventually, justice. But for now, she paused at her desk, looking at the photos of the other victims. Professional women just like her. Women who had been attacked simply for existing, for succeeding, for making their way in the world. She picked up her phone and dialed a familiar number. This is Captain Rodriguez. I need to schedule a community meeting. We need to talk about parking garage security, building access protocols, and self-defense classes for residents. Because while they had caught one attacker, there would always be others. And the best way to honor these women's experiences was to help prevent them from happening to anyone else. That was the real job after all, not just catching criminals, but protecting people. Not just solving crimes, but preventing them. Not just enforcing the law, but making their communities safer for everyone. Maya shook her head. You did exactly what you needed to do to survive. That's what matters. And now, you're here, helping us make sure he can't hurt anyone else. That's its own kind of fighting back. The meeting continued as they discussed next steps, shared resources, and made plans for future court dates. Maya watched as the women exchanged phone numbers, making plans to stay in touch, to support each other through the process. As they prepared to leave, the nurse turned back. Captain, when he attacked you, were you scared? Maya considered the question carefully. I was concerned, she said honestly. But I was also prepared. And that's what we want for all of you, not to live in fear, but to feel prepared, supported, and strong. After they left, Maya stood at her office window, watching them walk to their cars together, talking and sharing a moment of laughter. That was the real victory, not just catching a criminal, but helping people reclaim their sense of safety, their confidence, their community. Her phone buzzed with a message from the district attorney. They wanted to meet tomorrow to discuss the case. The evidence was strong, but there was still work to be done. There were statements to review, reports to finalize, procedures to follow. But for now, Maya took a moment to appreciate what they had accomplished. One attacker stopped. 3 survivors finding their strength. Countless potential victims protected. It wasn't just about law enforcement, it was about community, support, and the kind of change that happened one person at a time. She turned back to her desk, ready to tackle the next task. Because that's what the job was really about, not just catching bad guys, but helping good people find their way back to feeling safe, strong, and supported. The work wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But today, they had made a difference. And tomorrow, they would do it again. That was what the badge meant. That was what justice looked like. And that was why she loved this job, challenges and all. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters as Maya made her way inside. 3 months had passed since the night in the parking garage, and today was the final day of the trial. The air was thick with anticipation as she passed through security, nodding to the officers she knew. Inside the courtroom, she spotted the 3 survivors sitting together in the front row. They looked different now, stronger, more confident. They had supported each other throughout the trial, forming a bond that went beyond their shared experience. Their testimony had been powerful, clear, and unwavering. The district attorney caught her eye and gave a slight nod. The case was solid. The evidence was overwhelming. Still, Maya felt the familiar tension that came with any trial. Until the verdict was read, nothing was certain. She took a seat, adjusting her uniform. Over the past months, the case had grown beyond the original attacks. Their investigation had uncovered similar incidents in neighboring districts, leading to a broader understanding of how the attacker had operated. The judge entered, and everyone rose. Maya watched as the defendant was brought in. He looked smaller now, in his court clothes, nothing like the threatening figure from the parking garage. His eyes stayed fixed on the floor, avoiding contact with anyone in the room. The jury filed in next. Maya had testified yesterday, walking them through the events in the parking garage, explaining how the department had built the case. She'd kept her testimony professional, factual, but she'd made sure they understood the impact these crimes had on the community. "Will the defendant please rise?" the judge instructed. The courtroom fell silent. As the jury foreman stood to read the verdict, Maya thought about how much had changed since that night. The parking garage had new security cameras now, better lighting. The building had implemented stricter security protocols. But more importantly, the community had come together. On the count of attempted assault in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. The litany of guilty verdicts continued for each attack, for the attempted assault on a police officer, for the premeditated nature of his crimes. Each word seemed to lift a weight from the survivor's shoulders. After the judge set the sentencing date and the courtroom began to clear, Maya approached the three women. They had formed a support group for other survivors, turning their experience into something positive that could help others. "It's really over," the nurse said, her voice steady. "We did it." "You did it," Maya corrected gently. "Your courage made this possible." Outside, the media was waiting. The case had drawn attention not just for the attacks, but for how the community had responded. The survivors had become advocates, speaking out about safety, support, and the importance of coming forward. Back at the precinct later that day, Maya sat in her office reviewing the changes they'd implemented since the case began. New training programs for officers handling similar cases, better coordination with victim services, community outreach initiatives that were already showing positive results. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. One of her officers entered with a stack of reports. "Captain, you might want to see this. We're seeing a spike in women signing up for self-defense classes, and those safety workshops you suggested, they're all full with waiting lists." Maya smiled, taking the reports. This was the ripple effect they'd hoped for, not just solving crimes, but preventing them. Not just protecting people, but empowering them. Her phone buzzed with a message from the building manager where she lived. The new security system was fully installed, and they were planning a community safety meeting for next week. Residents had started looking out for each other more, forming walking groups for late-night shifts, sharing safety tips and resources. She thought about the young officer who'd helped with the case, how she'd grown more confident in her abilities. The case had become a teaching moment for the entire department about the importance of community policing, about seeing beyond just the crime to the larger impact on people's lives. The district attorney had called earlier, discussing how they could use this case as a model for handling similar situations. Other precincts had reached out, interested in implementing similar community safety programs. Maya stood by her window, watching the city as evening approached. Somewhere out there, people were heading home from work, feeling a little safer because of what they'd accomplished. The three survivors were moving forward with their lives, stronger for having faced their attacker and won. The conviction wasn't just about punishment, it was about justice, about showing that the system could work when everyone did their part. It was about turning victims into survivors, fear into strength, isolation into community. Her desk phone rang. Another building manager wanting advice on security improvements. As she answered, Maya realized that this case had become more than just an arrest and conviction. It had become a catalyst for change, a reminder that safety wasn't just about locks and cameras, it was about people looking out for each other. The sun was setting as she finished the call, casting long shadows across her desk. She gathered her things, ready to head home. The parking garage wouldn't feel the same as it had before that night, but that wasn't a bad thing. It was a reminder of what they'd accomplished, of lives changed and communities strengthened. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new opportunities to make a difference. But today, they had shown what was possible when people stood together, when fear turned to courage, when justice served not just as punishment, but as a foundation for positive change. That was the real victory, not just in the courtroom, but in the community. Not just in the verdict, but in the lives touched and transformed. And that was worth every moment of effort, every challenge faced, every step of the journey. 6 months after the trial, Maya stood at a podium in the police academy's main hall. Before her sat a new class of recruits alongside community members and fellow officers. The case that had started in a dark parking garage had evolved into something much bigger, a model for community-focused policing that was being adopted across the city. Real change, she began, looking out at the eager faces, doesn't just happen in dramatic moments. It happens in small steps, in daily choices, in communities coming together. The presentation screen behind her showed statistics from the past 6 months, decreased crime rates in parking structures, increased community engagement, successful prevention programs. But the numbers didn't tell the whole story. When I became a police officer 15 years ago, I thought the job was about catching bad guys, she continued. Now I know it's about something more. It's about building trust, creating connections, and helping people feel safe in their own communities. In the audience, she spotted the 3 survivors from the case. They had become regular speakers at community safety workshops, sharing their experiences and helping others find their strength. Their support group had grown, touching lives far beyond their original circle. Last year, we faced a series of attacks that threatened to paralyze our community with fear, Maya said. But instead of letting fear win, we saw something remarkable happen. People came together. They looked out for each other. They turned their experiences into action. She clicked to the next slide, showing photos of recent community initiatives, self-defense classes in the park, neighborhood watch meetings, safety workshops in schools and offices. Each image represented countless hours of work, dedication, and commitment from both police and community members. Today, we're not just teaching new officers how to enforce laws, she explained. We're teaching them how to be part of the communities they serve, how to listen, understand, and work together with residents to create lasting change. The training program they developed had already shown promising results. New officers were spending more time getting to know their neighborhoods, building relationships before crises occurred. The approach was different from traditional policing, but the impact was undeniable. When I look around this room, Maya continued, I see more than just police officers and community members. I see partners in creating safer neighborhoods. I see people who understand that real security comes from connection, not just protection. She shared stories from the past months, how the parking garage case had led to improved security measures across the city, how survivor support groups had helped people reclaim their sense of safety, how community involvement had made neighborhoods stronger and more resilient. The man who attacked those women thought he was targeting individuals who were alone and vulnerable, Maya said. What he didn't understand was that no one is truly alone when a community stands together. The sentencing had come down last month, 20 years, with no possibility of early release. But the real victory wasn't in the punishment. It was in the changes that had grown from the case, the lessons learned, the bonds formed. We've seen parking garages install better lighting and security systems, she noted. We've seen businesses offer late-night escort services for employees. We've seen neighbors checking on neighbors, looking out for each other, creating the kind of community where everyone feels safer. The police academy had updated its training protocols, incorporating more community engagement and emotional intelligence alongside traditional law enforcement skills. New officers were learning that their badge represented not just authority, but responsibility to the community. But perhaps the most important change, Maya said, her voice softening, has been in how we view safety itself. It's not just about locks and alarms, cameras and patrols. It's about people knowing they're not alone. It's about turning fear into strength, isolation into connection. She clicked to the final slide, showing a recent community gathering. Children playing in a park, neighbors chatting on porches, police officers walking their beats and stopping to talk with residents. It was a simple scene, but it represented everything they'd worked to achieve. This is what success looks like, she concluded, not just in lower crime statistics, but in stronger communities, not just in arrests made, but in crimes prevented, not just in laws enforced, but in lives improved. The applause that followed wasn't just polite, it was enthusiastic, genuine. People understood that they were part of something important, something that went beyond traditional law enforcement. After the presentation, Maya stayed to talk with attendees. New recruits asked questions about community policing techniques. Residents shared stories about positive changes in their neighborhoods. The 3 survivors hugged her, their strength and resilience an inspiration to everyone who heard their story. As the hall slowly emptied, Maya gathered her materials, thinking about all that had changed since that night in the parking garage. The case had taught them valuable lessons about prevention, community engagement, and the power of working together. But more importantly, it had shown them that real change was possible, not through dramatic gestures or quick fixes, but through consistent effort, genuine connection, and unwavering commitment to serving and protecting their community. That was the legacy of the case, the true measure of its impact. Not just in crime solved, but in lives transformed. Not just in justice served, but in communities strengthened. And that work would continue, one day at a time, one person at a time, making their cities safer and stronger for everyone.